Much debate goes into the ethnic backgrounds of certain religious figures. Many question the racial makeup of people like Jesus Christ, Muhammad, and Zoroaster. But today I want to take a look at the possible ethnicity of Siddhattha Gotama, aka Siddhartha Gautama, aka Shakyamuni, aka the Buddha. Before I get too ahead of myself, I need to address a few things first. For one, there's quite a bit of my fellow Americans out there who think that Buddha is a fat Chinese man because they see the so-called fat Buddha statue outside of every Chinese restaurant they've ever been to. For one, the Buddha was not born in China. And two, that fat guy is actually a completely different person. He was a Chinese Buddhist monk called Budai, and he approximately lived 1500 years after the Buddha existed. I also don't think it's really useful to try to characterize the Buddha as either Nepalese or Indian, as some people try to do. Was he born in what we today would call the country of Nepal? Yes. Was he a part of what we would label ancient Indian civilization? Of course, but to describe him as either Nepalese or Indian would be anachronistic and imprecise. These are two labels that describe modern nationalities and not ethnic groups from 2,500 years ago. Now I want to say that I have no racial bias or agenda. I'm going to support my assessment of the Buddha's ethnicity with ancient sources as well as ancient depictions in art. That being said, it's key that we know what kind of environment the Buddha lived in and what kind of people lived around him to understand his possible ethnicity. So before you bust out your old calipers and phenotype charts, let's go back in time and learn about the context in which the Buddha lived in. According to an Ashokan pillar edict, the Buddha was born in Lumbini, which is in modern-day Nepal. Well, really his birth name was Siddhartha Gotama. Buddha is more of a title. During the tail end of the late Vedic period, this area at the base of the Himalayas was settled by a clan known as the Shakya, the clan to which the Buddha belonged. This is why he's often referred to as Shakyamuni, meaning Shakya sage. The Buddha likely spoke a Prakrit dialect, however some scholars believe that the Shakyas could have been influenced by the Austroasiatic Munda people, suggested by the fact that the name for their progenitor of the Shakyas, King Okaka, is possibly of Munda origin. Now the Shakya were just one of many different tribes that inhabited ancient India during this time. You see, by the time of the late Vedic period, Indo-Aryans had spread from the Gandhara and Punjab regions into the more northeastern and central parts of the Indian subcontinent, eventually forming a patchwork of 16 major polities, the Mahajanapada. Most of these were kingdoms, and some of them, including the Shakya clan, were organized into a type of republic known as a Ganasangha, where Raja aristocrats of the Kshatriya caste would rule over a clan in a joint council. Gotama is often described as a prince, but really he was more like the son of a US senator. Something that must be noted about the Shakya Republic, and also many of their contemporaries surrounding them, is that they were pretty heterodox when it came to adhering to the Vedic tradition. Not saying the Brahminic caste was non-existent in these late Vedic societies, but it's just to say that they weren't really as powerful as they once were. Now, the Brahminic caste didn't really let go of this grudge against the Eastern territories for a while. In the Manu Smriti, it has this to say about the Videhas, Malas, and Lichavis, who during the time of the Buddha were part of the Vajika Confederacy. From a Vaishya by the females of the royal and the Brahmana castes spring a Magadha and a Videha, and, quote, from a Vratya of the Kshatriya caste, the Gala, the Mala, the Likhivi, the Nata, the Karana, the Kasa, and the Dravida. Now, if you don't know what this is saying, it's basically saying that these groups up near the Himalayas, amongst other groups, were basically either of mixed caste origins or are the result of people of a certain caste becoming Vratyas, which to put simply are like these roving outcasts who have turned their back on the Vedic rites. Given the heterodox nature of the region that the Buddha grew up in, it's not unimaginable as to why himself and Mahavira and, well, 5 other contemporaries that nobody really gives a shit about because they were nerds, were able to promote their own philosophical schools that ended up rivaling the Brahminic orthodoxy. So what can this simple background information tell us? Well, for one, it tells us that the ethnonym that the Buddha likely would have used to describe himself would be Shakya, specifically of the Khattiya or Kshatriya caste. It tells us that he likely would have spoken an Indo-Aryan language and would have been adjacent to, but not totally ingrained in, Vedic society. But this doesn't really tell us who the Shakyas really were, or what they looked like. We really know very little about the Shakyas themselves. It hasn't stopped people from speculating, however. Some scholars, mainly Christopher Beckwith, think that the Shakyas were in fact Scythian. I used to believe this myself, but I realized that the evidence is, well, kind of flimsy to say the least. The argument mainly relies on the fact that the word Shakya kind of sounds like Saka, the Saka being a name for Scythians that resided in the steppe and the Tarim Basin region of China. As far as I know, these are just false cognates. Now, I won't say that this is a strict impossibility, but I just find it lacking in evidence. Unfortunately, to find out who the Shakyas were, we can't really rely on genetic evidence because there isn't any. We do have some samples from Nepal that date around to the time of the Buddha. The only problem is that they were from the opposite side of the Himalayas. They had nothing to do with the Shakyas or any Indo-Aryan group. The most relevant samples we would have would probably be the ones from the Swat Valley in the Iron Age. However, I don't really know how relevant these would actually be to the Himalaya region in the late Vedic period. I don't really just want to speculate. So to get more information about the Shakyas and what the Buddha might have looked like, we're going to have to dig into early Buddhist sources as well as art. The Nikayas of the Pali Canon are the oldest sources we have of the Buddha's life and teachings. I'm going to be using the Thomas and Carolyn Rhys David's translations. When thinking about race and caste in the Nikayas, the section that really jumps out to me is the Ambattha Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. The sutta goes something like this. The Buddha was traveling around the neighboring kingdom of Kosala with his disciples when he set up camp outside of this village full of Brahmins. There's this one Brahmin named Ambattha. Ambatta's father, Pokaharasati, instructs Ambattha and some of the other Brahmins to go see Gotama and confirm whether or not he has the 32 characteristics of a great man. Quote, "They have been handed down, Ambattha, in our mystic verses, 32 bodily signs of a great man. Signs which, if a man has, he will become one of two things and no other. If he dwells at home, he will become a sovereign of the world, a righteous king, bearing rule even to the shores of the 4 great oceans, a conqueror, the protector of his people, possessor of the 7 royal treasures. But if he go forth from the household life into the houseless state, then he will become a Buddha, who removes the veil from the eyes of the world." When Ambattha meets him, he acts extremely rude and keeps insulting Gotama's Shakya heritage on account of him having bad experience with Shakyas. "Rough is this Shakya breed of yours, Gotama, and rude. Touchy is this Shakya breed of yours, and violent. Menials, mere menials, they neither venerate, nor value, nor esteem, nor give gifts to, nor pay honor to Brahmins." He also says, quote, "Once, Gotama, I had to go to Kapilavatu on some business or other of Pokarasadi's, and went into the Shakyas Congress Hall. Now at that time there were a number of Shakyas, old and young, seated in the hall on grand seats, making merry and joking together, nudging one another with their fingers. And for a truth, methinks, it was I myself that was the subject of their jokes. And not one of them offered me a seat. So after Ambattha insults his lineage some more, Gotama gets an idea. He decides to ask Ambattha for his family name so that he could know his lineage. Ambattha says that he is a Kanyan. Now, Kanha is a Pali word that translates literally to black or dark. The word in Sanskrit is Krishna. Gotama then has this to say. Yes, but if one were to follow up your ancient name and lineage, Ambattha, on the father's and the mother's side, it would appear that the Shakyas were once your masters, and that you are the offspring of one of their slave girls. But the Shakyas trace their line back to Okaka the king. Now, Okaka had a slave girl called Disa. She gave birth to a black baby, and no sooner was it born than the little black thing said, "Wash me, mother, bathe me, mother, set me free, mother, of this dirt, so shall I be of use to you." Now just as now, Ambattha, people call devils, devils, so then they called devils black fellows, and they said, "This fellow spoke as soon as he was born. 'Tis a black thing that is born, a devil has been born." And that is the origin, Ambattha, of the Kanayanas. After he brings this up, the god Indra appears before them, and Gotama says that if Ambattha does not admit to being of a low birth, then he will have Indra split his head open. So Ambattha finally admits it, and his fellow Brahmins are shocked. Gotama just roasted him and exposed him for being of low birth. However, Gotama was the bigger man. He goes on to say more about the story of Kana, and he also has this to say. "You should not, O Brahmins, be too severe to disparage Ambattha in the matter of his slave girl ancestress. That Kana was a mighty seer." It's often speculated that this Kana, the son of the slave girl Disa, is in fact Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita. Something else worth noting about the sutta is that Gautama Buddha actually considers Kshatriyas, the aristocratic warrior caste, to be superior to the Brahmin caste, on account of the fact that a Brahmin would accept a half Kshatriya, half Brahmin into their ranks, but a Kshatriya would not do the same for a half Brahmin. Quote, "Then, Ambattha, whether one compares women with women or men with men, the Kshatriyas are higher and the Brahmins are inferior." Unquote. Quote, "I also," Ambattha say, "the Kshatriya is the best of those among this folk who put their trust in lineage. but he who is perfect in wisdom and righteousness, he's the best among gods and men. In the rest of the sutta, Gotama explains to Ambattha why wisdom can actually trump lineage and caste. And then Pokarasati confirms that Gotama has the 32 marks and is indeed the Buddha, so he decides to become a disciple. I think the sutta is very useful because it confirms a lot of the basic info we know about the Shakyas. They had a congressional organization, they were seen as rude and disrespectful of the Brahmin caste, and they were descendants of King Okaka. They weren't entirely removed from the Vedic tradition, as it appears that the Buddha believed in the Rig Vedic god Indra, referred to as Vajrapani. However, they weren't as strict as the Brahmins. It also gives us some new information that is of use to this topic. For one, it shows that the Buddha considered the Shakyans to be distinct from those who were considered Kanha or black. This implies that they were fair in complexion. However, it is also implied in the sutta that during this time, being dark-skinned was not synonymous with being a demon or demonic, and that obviously the descendants of at least one dark-skinned man, Kana, had ingrained themselves within the Brahmin caste by this time. We also now know the Buddha's view on caste and lineage, that Kshatriyas are actually superior to Brahmins, but ultimately wisdom is of more importance than caste. Now in the Ambattha Sutta, the 32 marks are mentioned, which are 32 physical traits possessed by the Buddha. We can actually look at these marks as described in the Lakkhana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya to determine what physical traits he may have had that could give us some clue as to his ethnic background. Now one of these traits is more legendary and supernatural, him having the image of a dharma wheel on his feet. Others of these traits sound more like bizarre deformities: arms that extend down to his knees, 40 teeth, hands and feet like a net, i.e. webbed digits, and, quote, between the eyebrows appears a hairy mole, white and soft like cotton down, unquote. However, there are other traits that give us information about his more normal physical characteristics. Quote, his complexion is like bronze, the color of gold. The down on his body turns upward, every hair of it blue-black in color like eye paint, in little curling rings curling to the right. His eyes are intensely blue. His jaws are as a lion's. Unquote. So this sutta tells us that the Buddha had bronze skin. My interpretation of this is that his skin was either fair but tanned or olive or light brown colored. He also had blue eyes, which is a European trait he likely got from the steppe ancestors of the Indo-Aryan people. Now early Buddhist art confirms this phenotype as well. Most of the early Buddhist art simply uses symbology to depict the Buddha, either the Dharma wheel on a foot, an empty throne, or a tree. However, there are also anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha as a person, inspired by Greek art from the Indo-Greek kingdom. Most of these earlier anthropomorphic depictions are from Kushans in the Gandhara region, which is what we would today consider parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I showed this Buddha head in the beginning of my video. It's from Gandhara from roughly the 5th century AD, now on display at the St. Louis Art Museum. What's interesting is that you can actually see some faded pigmentation on this particular work. Blue eyes, reddish lips and skin, and black hair. I tried to reconstruct it the best I could just using the 3 types of paint that remained. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. I don't know exactly how this would have looked. But also, just keep in mind that this art comes way after the Buddha died. All this really goes to show is that there is continuity between how people thought the Buddha looked and how he was actually described in the suttas. Now this is what I can definitively say on the Buddha's ethnicity. 1. He was of the Shakya clan. 2. The Shakya clans did not consider themselves to be dark or black-skinned. 3. He had bronzed or golden skin with blue eyes and black hair. In my opinion, Siddhattha Gotama, or the Buddha, was likely of mostly Indo-Iranian descent, coming from the steppe people that migrated to Iran and India. I also think it's possible and even likely that he had some Dravidian ancestry as well, considering that this was the end of the late Vedic period, and as we read, even some Brahmins during this time period had become more mixed. Now look, none of this is really all that surprising when you consider the fact that you can still find people in South Asia today that have fair features and blue eyes. However, it says something very interesting about ancient India, that having blue eyes and golden skin was a necessary prerequisite to become the man who removes the veil over the eyes of the world.